Hello, guys. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to the series of AWS DevOps Unplugged. So, as part of today's episode, we are going to throw some light onto AWS serverless concept, where we are going to talk about building APIs with AWS API Gateway and AWS Lambda. For today's serverless specific talk, I have AWS Serverless Hero with us, who is Jones, and we would be having him on board where he would be sharing his experience in terms of serverless, how you can build the APIs. He might come up with some use cases. He's here to answer your queries, and a lot of thing is going to get covered. Let's get started and let's onboard our guest, that is Jones. So let me have him online. Hi, Jones.
Hi Dheeraj, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How about you?
Doing good. Thank you for having me here, Dheeraj. Great to be on DevOps Unplugged.
Yes. Thank you for accepting my invite and being on this live show where we are talking about AWS DevOps concept, which are the real time concepts that we talk about. So I think without wasting much time, Jones, I would hand it over to you so that you can start your introduction, introduce yourself, and we can start with the Q&A about today's topic.
Awesome, Dheeraj. Yeah. Thanks, Dheeraj. For those of you who don't know me, I am Jun Noel. I am a developer advocate at Freshworks, AWS Serverless Hero. I co-organize AWS UG Bangalore in India. And I run my own newsletter and blog called the Serverless Terminal. I do podcast with Zach, Arshad Zakaria, who is from New Zealand, called the Zach Show, talking AWS, around different topics around serverless, DevOps, and a lot of other things. So yeah, that's pretty much in a jiffy about me.
Okay. Thank you, Jones, for that. Thank you for your quick introduction. So, so as you know that today's topic that we are going to talk about is AWS serverless. So let's start with the first question. So let me ask you that what is the significance of building scalable APIs and why to choose AWS API Gateway and AWS Lambda for this purpose?
Yep. So the very question itself talks about scalability, right? When you talk about scalability and things like that, well, serverless is in the picture. API gateway, AWS API gateway, and Lambda functions are the two services that really stand out because the way how it could scale, cost effective, it's performant, it's available, all that really ticks the checkbox and making it really good option for building serverless APIs. The one thing that really talks about the two services is that the very definition of serverless, because when we think of serverless, you don't want really to manage infrastructures, you don't want to have a huge burden of cost when things are really idle. And these two services, especially with respect to performance, with respect to cost, really checks those boxes with serverless. And building APIs with API gateway is really an efficient way because if you would want to have things like rate limiting, if you want to have things like routing to different endpoints or different methods, all of that is supported. You could even do validation of your input that's coming in. That's how easy it is with API gateway, Dheeraj.
Okay, thank you, Jones, for that. So, moving towards our next question, Jones. So we spoke about the scalability. We spoke about what AWS API Gateway is. So, would you like to let us know what are the core components of an API built with AWS API Gateway? So, in core component means what are the different methods that you use? How is the interface of API Gateway? So people who are new, l- let them have a flavor of what exactly you are talking about. So if you want, you can share your screen also if you are comfortable to showcase that what
Sure.
kind of core components you want to talk about.
Sure, Dheeraj. Probably I'll share the screen at the later point of time where I show you all of these things that we discuss about. But to talk about the core components of API Gateway, right? If you just think about APIs itself in general terms, the different components. That could be things like, hey, what are the different HTTP methods does my API support? What kind of authorization does my API support? And what kind of computation or the ways which it could compute different payloads is supported, right? All of these things, when you resonate with API Gateway, what really happens is that API Gateway provides you different components with respect to authorization, with respect to building all of these routing capabilities. Because when you want to have APIs, say for example, you're getting a movie database kind of an API where you want to list the movies, the actors, the different series in the movie, or anything like that. You don't want to use different endpoints, right? Maybe it's just a different resource that you have. Say, for example, api.com/actors, api.com/movie, something like that is something in general terms is what your API should look like, and managing those different resources. And with serverless, right, it's not a monolith structure. Instead, it's all distributed across. It could be things like, hey, for a specific API, it's compute heavy and you have to invoke a Lambda function, or it has to invoke a EC2 instance, or it should have to invoke a Fargate or anything like that. It's possible. And when you're talking about these different routes, all of these different routes could have parameters either coming in the body, or it could be parameters that are there in the URL itself. All of these could be configured as part of API Gateway's API specs. And when it's consumed and when it's integrated with things like Lambda functions, you could get all of these parameters and process them in your computation layer, making it such an easy way for developers to define what their API is, how they want to structure the API request, and how are they going to process the API request. And coming to authorization, API Gateway supports multiple types of authentication. It could be a simple API key-based authentication to something that is OAuth specific. And if you want to have a custom authorization, that's possible with Lambda functions powered under the hood. So all of that are the capabilities of API Gateway. And for somebody who's beginning, say for example, you have a web application and you want to render a different kind of APIs, all that could be defined in your API Gateway with different methods, with different resources, with different query parameters or body parameters based on the type of request it is, and consumed by your Lambda function. And when you're doing all of these things, there are different ways that you could even define models for your API Gateway to ensure that, hey, I want to ensure that the specific endpoint gets certain input parameters, and I'm going to validate if it's part of the parameter or not, if it's the right type of the data that's coming in or not. And all of this is possible. Imagine doing this in the traditional way, right? You have to ensure that you have your node server or express server that's running. You get the request, you validate the request, you have a layer that is actually doing validation of the request is valid or not, and then moving ahead. All that is being taken care by API Gateway itself, making it very easy for you to focus on application code and building on the business logic. I see some comments from Avinash. Hi, Avinash.
Lambda. So he is in love with Lambda, as always, being from the developer background and a lot of activities that he do, uh, serverless activity. So Jones, I think, are you completed or?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So thank you so much for explaining that core concepts in detail about AWS API Gateway and AWS Lambda. So now moving forward, let's talk in a real-time format.
Mhm.
Suppose you want to define, being a DevOps engineer, you have to design some strategies for your serverless implementation. So what strategies can an organization employ to ensure the availability of their APIs by using the AWS API Gateway
Mhm.
and AWS Lambda?
Yep. So, firstly, the service itself is available always. I don't want to say the exact 99.9999. percent available because it's serverless. And the very definition of serverless is that the infrastructure is going to be managed by the cloud provider. Here it's AWS, where AWS is going to manage and ensure that these services are available for consumption. And when you're building here with API gateway in the traditional or in the enterprise ecosystems, what really happens is that we want to ensure that the APIs are available, the APIs are secure, the APIs don't hit with different DDoS attacks, things like that, right? So API gateway provisions you with integration with different services like WAF, which is for web application firewall, where it ensures that things like DDoS attacks are uh, uh, captured or it's recognized, and you could avoid DDoS attacks that's there for your APIs. And also, when you think of enterprise grade APIs, right? Oftentimes, people want to ensure that their APIs don't really spam their systems, and they don't create a havoc for computation so that it just runs different processes, and under the hood it's a lot of computation power that's being used. So to ensure all of these things, things like rate limiting and throttling is available as part of Lambda function, where as part of API gateway, where API gateway has this concept called stages, and whenever you deploy an API, it's to a specific stage. And when you're deploying to a stage, you can ensure that if it is with API, the authentication is with API key, you can ensure the usage metrics to ensure that, hey, this specific API key should have a throttling limit of certain numbers or a rate limit of certain numbers, and you could do all of those things. Apart from all of these things, you could integrate with things like CloudFront for edge caching. So, say for example, if you are using an API which is used globally, and you want to ensure that data for certain users should be available very quickly, the best way to do it is to cache it in the regional location. So, what CloudFront does is that it ensures that the data is cached at the edge level, and when you request, it's the cached data that's we return, so that under the hood, it's not making another request to API gateway to your Lambda functions, involving a lot of latency and also computation power under the hood that's being used. Where with caching, you could avoid all of these things, and data is also retrieved fast. So it's a good experience for users when they're using these, when you're consuming these APIs on a web app or a mobile application or anything such, right? Say, for instance, you're using a mobile application, and you're making certain actions on the web application, and it's under the hood using some APIs. If it has latency, you would see a loader, and that's a very bad experience. With caching, all of these data that has to be retrieved, and that needs faster retrieval, or certain things that don't change very frequently, you could cache it. And as soon as the application is opened, either mobile or web or anywhere, you could see the data in matter of milliseconds. And that's the power of giving you caching and ensuring that it has a very less latency. The other factor that really plays along is that enterprises would want the domains of the APIs to be under their own domains, right? Say, for example, it has to be something like AWS.com or things like that, or in this case, API gateway generates a system generated endpoint, which is something like there is an API ID, then there is Amazon domain, that there is a couple of parameters like the staging environment, the endpoints, all of these things. It's a long URL, and it's hard. And for enterprises, they are very specific in terms of ensuring, hey, I want this to be as abcd.com API itself. To ensure all these things, you could even use Route 53 and use custom domains to integrate all these APIs with Route 53, ensuring that, hey, to the outside world, it's still your own domain that's being called, but under the hood, it's all powered with API gateway.
Okay, thank you, Jones, for the detailed explanation. That's really appreciable. So now, as we have discussed about the strategy, the core components that is required for designing your scalable APIs by using AWS API Gateway and Lambda. So now, what I would request you is, can you help us drive from inception to deployment about a scalable APIs creation by using AWS
Certainly,
Lambda
Dheeraj.
and the API Gateway?
Certainly. Let me share my screen. Okay. Screen is better way to design all the APIs with a graphical user interface, right? First, I thought, okay, I'll use a SAM or a CDK to demonstrate how do you do this, all of this. But then this thought hit me that, hey, Application Composer is one of these services which enables you to graphically design and define all of your resources for a specific use case on serverless. So I'll be using Application Composer, where I'll show you how you could define your API gateway and also generate SAM template, which is a way where you use a defined YAML template that can be deployed to your AWS account. So what I'll do is, from my AWS account, I go to Application Composer, and here when I hit on a new project, this is the place where I landed to. You can see there are different services that are supported by Application Composer. What I do is I add an API gateway, and going back to the same concept of a movie database, what I do is I'll have an endpoint which gets all the movies and save. You can see that a specific endpoint has been created, and I want it as a get method. So even the HTTP method get is being defined. Let me add the Lambda function. With this, I can just define which of my API endpoint is defined to which Lambda function. I'll just mention the name as movies. And when you're doing all of these things, you might want to even say like, hey, I want a specific movie. And to define that, what you could do is you could add a route which says movies slash ID. So you could see that I'm defining ID as a URL parameter, and I'll add another Lambda function. And here is the connector. So what I'm doing right now is just that I'm listing movies, or I'm getting a specific movie with a ID that's there in the URL parameter. To do all of these things, imagine if you would have to do it with a traditional way, you might have to think like, hey, I have to design my, or I have to first get my web server up, and then ensure that I have my different routes ready on a script, ensure all the different routes are there in a specific script, all of it, right? In case of serverless APIs, it's just a matter of defining the different configurations for API gateway and Lambda functions. What Application Composer is doing is that with the design that I just entered, it's also creating the YAML template where it's defining my API endpoint, ensuring that, hey, the different resources has a part of it, the paths has been defined. You can see that the path has a ID. All of these things are defined. when i when all of these things is being defined, I'm also enabling things like tracing is enabled, the cross origin that's there as part of HTTP endpoints is also enabled, and then the different Lambda functions that it uses, all of those are defined, and you can see that the events for these are defined with respect to what type of a request is being done from which endpoint of your API gateway. So if it is things like you want to add more endpoints to this, so add a route. Say for example, you want to create a new movie, you could define the method HTTP method as put and define the whole route where this could create another lambda function. And yes, so what I'm doing here is that just with the change of endpoints, I'm able to ensure that the routing to the specific Lambda functions is defined on API Gateway itself. What, like we were just mentioning earlier, the very ease of ensuring that the different routes go to a specific resource or a specific AWS resource, anything like that could be managed on API Gateway. So for movies, I wanted to go to a specific Lambda function. For movies with an ID in the URL parameter, I want that to hit a different Lambda function. To create a new movie with a different endpoint, it has to again hit a different Lambda function. So all of these routing is managed on API Gateway, and the ease of defining all of these from application composer is just that ensuring you add a new resource to each endpoint and then create it with and add the connections to the Lambda function. You could see the same thing on the on API Gateway console, where I go to API console, create new API. With API Gateway, you could create a different type of APIs. For now, we'll look into REST APIs. I'll just add demo. Demo. It's created the default path with slash. This was the same thing that you saw on Application Composer. And here you could start creating resources. It could be things like I want to add my resource as movie. And you can see that for each resource that I create, I can enable cross or not. When I create this options header is also created because I'm ensuring that it's crossing. I'll go create different functions. Let me just create a So when you're defining different methods, since you're not using the traditional infrastructure as a code approach, here what you're doing is with the console itself, you first have to create your Lambda function and then create the association with the different endpoints. So I'll just create a new Lambda function. Demo. I'll go with the default settings. I'll use the on. As my Lambda function is created, I am just enabling this with the any method. I'll add get. You can see that there are different kinds of Lambda integration that's available. One is the traditional way where you do a request response mapping. The other one is with uh, Lambda proxy based integrations, where you just go with the default request response integration. So you can see that the Lambda API Gateway endpoint movies is integrated with the Lambda function. And the next action is to ensure that I deploy the API. So I create a new stage, say demo, deploy, and it creates an endpoint for the specific stage. I use the stage URL, go here, slash movies, and here's a response from the Lambda function. It's just that simple when you want to just create a simple API which returns data from a Lambda function. Uh, since this was more from the console, not the best practices way to deploy all of these APIs. The other best way to do it is with Application Composer, where you can create all of these things, all the resources that's needed. You could use the SAM template and use SAM deploy. SAM is a CLI for serverless, where you could manage your applications, deploy them, create pipelines, and ensure that you have a very good way to ensure it's syncing, the resources syncing from your local to this cloud. All of that is possible with SAM, and Application Composer generates the SAM template for you to deploy them to your cloud. So it's that simple, Dheeraj. To just create a Lambda function, you have to integrate it with the API gateway, and voila, you already have an API that's returning a response from Lambda function.
That's fantastic, Jones. Nice to know that, and a good demo. Like I wasn't expecting the application composer to come into picture over here. I thought you might be creating that by using the console that we have in API gateway along with AWS Lambda. But this one was, something unique and kind of appealing thing that people would like to use. That eases your job in terms of creating API gateway and making the connection between them. So as part of application composer, as you drag and drop automatically create the connections, then we have to just make the basic configuration that is already in place, or if it is in advance, we have to make that changes.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Jones, for that. So now as we have seen from inception till deployment, so now let's talk about some troubleshooting sort of things or some kind of monitoring that we have. So when we are deploying a API, at that moment we have to handle the traffic which is coming via that API, uh, right? So we have to check the API traffic rate. We have to check the traffic limiting. So this kinds of uh, real-time scenarios which comes in a production environment. As per your understanding, that how can that be handled?
Okay, so I'll go first with the observability part of it, where how do you trace or how do you look at logs with API Gateway? If you observed while I was creating things on Application Composer, and hey, great to see you, Vishal, joining us. So, hi, Vishal. So, uh, with Application Composer, you might have noticed that there was a parameter that said tracing enabled, and it was true. Why was that? Is because it enables tracing under the hood. So what you could use as options is that CloudWatch logs is available, where by default you could enable all the errors to be logged, or there's an option where you could ensure that it logs everything, like from invocation, if there's any errors, if there's any infos, it logs all of it. And the other one is X-ray. So when all of these requests come in, and API gateway being the forefront for all the requests that is coming in and then being distributed across. I wouldn't want to say only Lambda function, because API gateway can invoke multiple such AWS services. And when it does invoke different services, you have to ensure that whenever any request that's going there has been successfully responded back or not. If there's some errors, you want to debug it. So XRA really plays a vital role here, because with the trace ID, you could ensure that where did the request go? Was it successful? Was there any error? Was it failing? What is the reason for failing? All that is possible with CloudWatch logs and X-ray tracing. The other part of it where you were asking is that, hey, how do I ensure that there's not throttling the rate limits? That is possible, where you could define for each deployment and different stages that you deploy into, telling that, hey, I want to have specific rate limits for my stage to ensure that anything that crosses above that threshold hits an error back to the client, and there is no error that's happening apart from API gateway, so that it's just blocking spamming traffic. And when you want to ensure all of these things, strategies would involve API gateway based usage plans. And also, what you could do is you could create your own uh, authorizers with Lambda functions and ensure that there's JWT tokens, where there was this solution that we worked in the past where you needed to have custom rate limits for different uh, instances, and it was a SaaS-based product, so you had to ensure that API gateway was allowing those requests, but once it hits, you had a custom logic where you ensured, hey, there's some traffic coming in from specific IPs, from specific invokers, be it things like you don't want things to be invoked from a local host, or you don't want things to be invoked from Postman, and you could block all of it with additional things on the Lambda function. So yes, that is possible.
So thank you, Jones, for explaining that. So now, as we have covered the development, the deployment, the core concepts. So now let's talk about something about security. So when you are developing the APIs, so what is the security aspect that you should keep in mind while you are developing your APIs, so that it fits in the best possible way based on your security posture that you have for your production environments.
Yep. Security plays an important role here, because having APIs that can do operations on your data, essentially modifying the delete, and when you're doing all of these things, it has to be secure. So API gateway itself provides you with different ways how you can authorize the API request. It could be with API keys that I was just explaining. It could be things like IAM roles. It could be things like where from Amazon Cognito. So Cognito is another user group and identity management service where if you're building something like a web app or a mobile application, you could use Cognito to authenticate users. And once it is done, you could use Cognito's identity to authorize those API requests. And this way, it's more secure, and it's for that specific user who's logged in, and for the identity and during that specific session. So when you're doing all of these things for authorization, API Gateway didn't stop there. It started supporting things like OAuth-based authentication and also having custom authorizations. So most of the times when you work with enterprises have their own uh, ways of authorizing different requests. And when you want to do all of those things in a straightforward way, it may not be possible. So what you could do is create Lambda functions as custom authorizers, and the authorizing request will first go to Lambda. Lambda will give back a response saying, hey, it's an authorized request, and then it proceeds ahead. So all of that is done in the gatekeeping section itself of API Gateway's authorization section. And the other point with respect to things like using different other services for WAF, for DDoS attacks, or things like that is also possible. So the security itself ensures that it's very secure. And when you want to go to fine grain access, define you want there are instances where people do injection and try to do a lot of database manipulation using SQL injection or a lot of these injection techniques, right? So when you do all of these things, you could define models where essentially you're telling that, hey, my API gateway requires these set of parameters, and these set of parameters have to follow a specific data type. So all of those validation verification of data is possible. So you don't really have to worry, hey, is my data that's coming in as parameters secure or not secure, because API gateway can do that for you.
Thank you, Jones, for that. So, after covering all these use cases, I think it's time that you also discuss about some real-time use case or some real-time implementation that has been done onto AWS cloud side for any of the customer case study that we can talk about. So, is there something that you want to talk about?
Do you remember the site that was called Coven? Pretty famous when it was when the COVID hit, and uh, there were a lot of these concern where you had to know, uh, is the vaccine available? Is COVID around my vicinity or things like that? So in India, Coven was one of the applications that was developed, and it significantly uses API gateway and Lambda functions. So you could think of the number of requests that the Coven app is making. Be it a lot of times people were facing things like, "Hey, I'm rate limited. I cannot search for things." Right? All this was just configuration on API gateway, and when you're defining these things, the ease where you could just build applications, be it for Cohen, where the necessity of deploying and making that app available in a matter of days is something that was very crucial, because you wanted to know the real stats that's happening around you, and the very ease of development with respect to API gateway, where you could build things and ship it to production, is that high. The same thing where you could deploy to different instances, testing, all of that with things like infrastructure as code, where you have, I was just talking about SAM pipelines, where it could deploy to different instances where you have a test environment, you test things, and you could publish it to a production environment, and that's that done. So the ease of go to market with building with API gateway and Lambda functions is that easy that I remember seeing one of the case studies that Cohen had published a couple of years back. I mean, around 2020 and 2021 was is that they were able to build all of this in a matter of days, and they were able to handle requests across India. And when a lot of people are using it across India at the same time, the app was also scalable in terms of ensuring all these requests are fulfilled. Of course, there were rate limit issues because it ensured that the same person is not invoking again and again, and it causes a havoc in the system. But otherwise speaking, it's really easy to build these things, and there were Coven is just one example, and there are many more customers who are building on top of this. In fact, even at Freshworks, there's a lot of these things that's been built with AWS serverless technologies, and the way it's built, the ease of development, the ease of managing the application is so easy, because the infrastructure side is something that you don't have to worry about, and uh, AWS ensures that all of these things are available and scalable at any given point of time. So that's the power of serverless. You're on mute, Dheeraj.
Yeah, just give me 1 minute. I think there is some issue.
So it's not just Coven, and there are many more things like Fox Networks is one of them, where uh, you could go to API gateway, API documentation site, and then it has a lot of customer case studies defined, where they tell you about, hey, how they are using API gateway, and their use cases are to serve millions and millions of requests at a given second, and API gateway is able to solve all of those concerns that they have, and uh, building scalable applications is that of an efficient way with API gateway and Lambda functions.
Thank you, Jones, for such an incredible uh, uh, use case that actually helped us to understand that how it can be used and how it has been used in India in terms of the from the COVID perspective. So that was a very good example. Honestly speaking, I was not aware of it. So that's an interesting use case, and I'm sure if there is any specific documentation which might tell us more about this, that would be really that will be really helpful.
Yes. I don't have the link to the white paper that was published about this very same case study, but I'll try to find it and I'll add it in the comments. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I think we so in today's use case, I think we have covered about the main serverless complete concepts, that is AWS API Gateway, AWS Lambda. What are the core concepts while you are developing a AWS API Gateway along with Lambda? Apart from that, the strategies that an organization should strategize while implementing the serverless implementation. And last but not the least, the interesting COVID use case. So thank you, Jones. Thank you so much for sharing all this important information and real-time information with me and my audience. So I think there is a glitch. Somebody has pinged saying that my voice is having an echo. I tried to change my
Yes.
headphones. This is my third headphone. Unfortunately, I don't know what exactly is happening, but maybe I have to, uh, you know, go with the same thing because it's not getting fixed automatically. Maybe some issue from the stream side.
Why think of it as an issue? It's more of an effect that you're adding here. Yeah.
That's true. That's true. Anyways, thank you, Jones. Thank you for joining on this live session. I really appreciate that. And I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope you enjoyed the questions that we had today. And thank you for sharing all the knowledge about serverless. So, guys, if you don't know about Jones, I will again reiterate it. Jones is our AWS Hero, serverless hero, where he is having a very good uh, contribution towards serverless, where he shares knowledge about different serverless services. He has his own YouTube channel that he runs with is one of the like-minded person,
Exactly.
that is Zach. So there also they discuss about many of the concepts about serverless. So if you want to learn something more and in depth in regards to serverless, uh, Jones is the right person that you have to reach out to. So if you have any questions, drop your questions after this directly to Jones on his LinkedIn channel, and Jones will be happy to answer all this question for you. Right, Jones?
Absolutely, Dheeraj. So, any queries around serverless, you can hit my DM.
Yes. Thank you, Jones. Thank you for that. So thank you guys for joining this incredible session that we had today in regards to serverless. And as I know that this is a weekend, then you all might be waiting to enjoy your weekend. So have a great weekend, and see you in the next episode where we would be talking about some new concept which would be a industrial level concept that would help you to understand what kind of strategies and what kinds of concepts you should put in place to get the things going and to get the things moving. So thank you once again for joining this live episode. Thank you and have a great weekend ahead. Goodbye. Thank you, Jones.
Thanks to you as well, Dheeraj.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.